Is it your intent to change your models so that they reflect the data that you're finding as a way of closing the loop? Or?
Ultimately, yes. I think before we move to really trying to manipulate the models, we need to get to this to have I think a really good way of saying, suppose I change the model, how do I know that that change was good? And I think the validation step has been where we've been stuck. So we're making progress on that. I think we have a number of good ways to do it, but we haven't yet then gone back to the models to try to tweak them yet. That's a clear step to go to, though.
Do you have any sort of preliminary thoughts about how you might do that?
Honestly, I haven't thought about it in great detail. I've been sort of, one's path through any of these kinds of projects sort of wanders around a little bit, and our most recent work has actually been trying to put different kinds of animal groups into some kind of framework that brings them all together. So again, the modeling has been pushed off a little bit in that.
There was a question, yes.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up a little bit on this. Do you think learning from the different swarm behaviors that actually people can there are situations where people really can learn or behave in a swarm, or it will be always sort of a fake simulation because the swarm have really a target to fulfill a goal. They're very targeted to reach something, and they take a collective decision. Where for people, not necessarily a goal needs to be reached, but it might be also to understand the diversity of opinions in a particular situation.
I wouldn't say that many of these animal systems have a goal in mind. If you think about it, so some bird flocks are going someplace, but many of them are just doing some kind of aerial display in the evening. The insect swarms that I work with aren't going anywhere. They're stationary. They just sit still. Their goal is to be visible. So that females can find them. So I don't think I wouldn't agree that these kinds of collective animal systems are all goal-driven. And broadening out from that, the way I see it is that what we're looking at is some kind of broad framework that you can then, if you understand how it works and how you go from individual rules to group function, then you can start to say, this is the functionality I want. How do I design rules that will get me the functionality I want? And hopefully in a more flexible way where you can now design for functionality you don't necessarily see in nature. That's a pie in the sky kind of thing, but that would be nice.
Thank you.
So, Hauchi from Northwestern University, really nice talks. My question is for Eche and for Dan. I think one of the things that caught my attention is, especially in Dan's talk, starting to see these examples where we were actually having humans do more interesting things, that they were really starting to crowdsource some more notion of general computation as we were talking about it, where there's argumentation, there's rewriting of instructions, and really thinking more deeply than just labeling. So I think my general question to the two of you is, both from a perspective of leveraging human intelligence for doing the task, but perhaps also for the task to be more enriching and engaging, but maybe fundamentally more rewarding, right? You could even imagine teaching argumentation as part of this. What do you see as the role moving forward for these kinds of tasks that you guys have seen that may have more of a human flavor, so to speak, moving forward? And how might we do that in such a way that gives us the productivity kind of gains we want, but perhaps also the enriching to the task for the humans that participate?
Go first.
Okay, I go first. So I think the reason we focused on labeling for the last 5 to 10 years is because it is the simplest form of input you can get from a human. We know we can make a lot of the statistical models we already have work for categorize data and these simple labels. And I think as we are looking into deeper integration between the human and the crowd, we are going to get to larger communication channels between them. And I think Dan's work and his students are a way towards that. And me with my colleagues, we've been going in the same direction too, trying to use discussion, mental model discovery of both machines and humans to try to open up that communication channel between the machine and the human. For example, there are a lot of interesting directions about like how do you teach a reinforcement learning agent how to act in the world with the crowd input. And there the label is not the right way of thinking about it. It's more about teaching about the structure of the world and trying to say like, these are the kind of things you should never try and these are the things you should try. So I think that's definitely a path that a lot of people are thinking about. There are challenges in terms of making our current quality models and the statistical models work when you open up the discussion channels and communication channels. The other challenge is kind of have a good representation of the mental state of both the human and the machine so that they can understand each other. That turns out to be another big problem, and that relates very heavily to the transparency problems in AI and how to represent the internal uncertainty of the machine to the human. So I think there are a lot of challenges. But the other thing I personally see when I experiment with crowd platforms like Mechanical Turk is that the more interesting the task becomes and the more challenging it becomes for the humans, we have to worry about the quality challenges less. Because people really appreciate being challenged and also having something more interesting and fun and challenging to do. So maybe this issue about quality models and statistical models, making them work in this more complex task is not such a big deal anyway.
I also think it's a really great question, and I think that I, anyway, have been sort of erred a little bit on the side of trying to do the easy experiments rather than the harder, more interesting ones where you get people involved in a more important way. And I think it's really hard to do that. So I think one open question is, what's the right interface? So HA brought up a great example of the Centaur systems in chess where a person and a chess computer can play much better. My understanding, though, is that it's basically there's no change to the chess playing program. It just plays chess. I think the really interesting question is if you want a chess playing program that exists just to provide advice and aid to a human being, how should it differ? What should the interface be? How should the human and the computer talk to each other? Presumably there's higher level things that they might want to say to each other rather than, I move here, do an exhaustive search. So what are those higher level ways of communicating between the people and the machine and these kinds of collectives? I think that's one great question. I think in many cases that answer is going to be domain specific. So probably my very favorite example of a mixed human computer system that's achieved really impressive results that are better than either could do alone is the folded system done by Zoran Popovic and Baker's lab at the University of Washington. So this is a collaborative game, if you will, where people work together along with computer tools to come up with a three-dimensional structure of proteins. And they've solved some open problems in terms of the structure of AIDS proteins that were outstanding for 15 years and so on. So you've got a housewife in New Zealand collaborating with a graduate student in some other place, and together a group of them are able to solve these problems. I think it is an incredibly cool and successful program, but it also took them many years to figure out what were the right ways to allow the people to collaborate with each other, building up these tools that allowed the computer to help the people. And I think we're still short of figuring out what are the general principles for building those kinds of systems that allow that high-level interaction.
Emil Sorenschreiber from Hypermind. I have a high-level question for all of you. Is you talk about artificial intelligence, collective intelligence, not so much yet about human intelligence per se. But my question is, in the future, we know AI isn't perfect now. It's going to improve. There's also a lot of work on getting those hybrid systems of AI and humans to work together. Is there a fundamental difference in your view between what AI can be when it's really good, in the types of intelligence that it is, compared to human intelligence? Will there always be some kind of natural specifics to human intelligence that will be complementary to AI, or is AI going to catch up and be competitive with that eventually? And is there also a natural specifics to collective intelligence? So these three types of intelligence, is there something very specific to each of them, or do they all converge to the same thing eventually?
Let me go first. I think it's a great question. And obviously nobody really knows. We'll find out over time. Obviously computers are obviously much smarter than people already at many tasks, whether it's arithmetic or chess or Go or what have you. And so it seems clear that computers are going to become better and better at a much wider range of tasks over time. Probably ones that involve interpersonal relationship and emotion and so on are going to be the last to go. And I think it's an open question whether computers will ever get there. It seems hard to believe, but exponentials lead to behaviors that are hard to predict. So I think we'll really have to see, but my money would be on collective intelligence being the best going forward. And finally, the one thing where I think we really don't want to allow, the one place where it's really essential to keep humans in the loop is specifying the utility function and making sure that that the collective is working on the right thing.
I think a lot of the issues you are bringing up are open questions because there is not an agreement even in the AI world about what the current, for example, neural structures we have, neural representations we have, how similar or different they are compared to human neural structure, although we call it neural network. It is, I think, to me, it is clear that it's not a neural network that's between our ears. But some researchers claim that it is a very similar structure and it should have the same properties that the human neural structure has. And I think one issue is really human can learn from very few examples, and that's definitely not the case for the current computational architectures we have, and there's a lot of work that's going on in zero-shot learning or one-shot learning, where the idea is getting that sample size to be really small and make machines learn from very small number of instances, and it is very clear we are very far from that. And I've seen Sam from Harvard gave a great talk a few days ago at a conference where he was really comparing the learning rates of humans and machines together for some tasks that we claim computers are very good at right now. And it is not really fair to compare the end performance. You really need to look at how things are progressing with the sample size, and there are clear differences in that. So I think even for the tasks, we say machines are doing a great job. We are actually far behind when you consider the whole curve of learning. And I think there is a lot of work to be done in terms of just putting the real world structure into learning and figure out how we can learn much more generally from small number of examples.
Hi, so this is a kind of a meta question, I guess, that goes to several of the talks and kind of some more general thought I've been thinking about over the last day. And that's kind of about, on the issue of the utility function. So it strikes me that there have been several projects that are about trying to infer the characteristics of a group that lead to good decisions, but then not all decisions have the same structure also. So for example, you could imagine that in the context of humans, we care about making a single choice for everyone, and then humans may disagree over actually what their values are. So there's a fundamental disagreement at the individual level about kind of what the utility function is. And this is a fundamental problem that's been around in social choice and economics for like 100 years. And I'm curious as to when we think about that kind of aggregation problem, that's where there's a single choice that needs to be made by a group, and that's kind of the problem of democracies. And I'm curious as to how that maybe varies, maybe this is more directed at Nick, but not really, from the kinds of collective decision problems that, for example, ants face, where we might expect that their underlying preferences are more correlated, and therefore like aggregation rules and the mapping kind of from the functional characteristics to the group choice is a more linear one, if that makes sense.
So let's see how to unpack that. I will say that I have tried, at least in my work, to be fairly agnostic as to what the purpose of aggregations is, because I think there are a lot of examples in the literature of situations where people thought they knew, say, what an animal group was trying to accomplish, and then when you actually look, are they optimizing for that? They're not. So I think with animals in particular, we tend to project our own assumptions onto the animals. Nevertheless, I think it's a critical kind of a critical issue to think about, because if you're trying to design a model, say, you know, the motivation I led with was, let's look at animals and then extract rules and then build engineered systems. You can't do that process unless you have you can't design unless you know what you're designing for.
Exactly.
So as much as possible, I've been trying in studying the animal systems to develop an understanding of how you map from individual rules to group structure, and less so on the function side, because I don't feel I know what the function is, and I'm worried about that. So as much as possible, I try to neglect it. That's not necessarily sustainable or the long-term goal that one wants to go toward, but I think it's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I guess my point is, how do you think about validating at all in the context where you have no sense of what the objective function is?
So I do it purely based on kinematics. So that's sort of, to me, the most objective ground truth I can have is statistics of, like, you know, animal A went over here at that speed and animal B went over there at that speed. And at least at a statistical level, I would expect that to be, it's kind of an intermediate step, but at least I can measure that. Otherwise, I'm putting myself into the validation process, and I'd like to try to take that out so that I can be as objective as possible. I don't know if you guys want to jump in on this.
I would just add, and I'm guessing I speak for HA as well, but I have a different kind of agnosticism, and that is assuming that the utility function is an input. So if somebody does specify a utility function, how do we design the system to do the best job it can at optimizing that utility function? And that does beg a lot of questions, because humans have a hard time articulating their utility function. Usually it's better with concrete examples and so on. And there's, of course, a literature on how to do preference elicitation, but I've been taking that as an input.
Just one sentence. There is some interesting work going on in inverse reinforcement learning in terms of learning the utility function from the behavior. And I think that's an interesting direction. It's a hard problem, but sometimes the way people behave may be a better representation of their utilities than asking them, how do you feel about this situation?
Okay, that's going to be the last word. Let's thank our speakers.